Hello and welcome, I'm Tafaragadamu. Ethiopian athletes have continued doing well in different venues around the world. But what does it take to get to that state of perfection? And who gets what? Is it a fair business? Over a period of several years, my guest today, Hannah Borenstein, undertook research for her PhD. Her conclusions are pretty challenging. A very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
It is impressive that Ethiopian athletes fared exceptionally well in recent events held, for example, in Oregon, right?
Yeah, they did really well. And also at the World Under-20 Championships in Colombia, where
that happened right after that, basically.
Yeah.
Do you agree that it was, they did very, very well, and I was wondering why this time around, because it looks like it was like a flood, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it reminded me a little bit of in 2018 when I went to the Finland Junior Championships and they didn't do very well, but athletes often talk about like morale as something that you give as kind of like collective experience. And so I think that like the sort of collective training style that Ethiopian runners have been more accustomed to than other countries, the way that they kind of like get into a hotel and train together. I know some people have problems with that. But I think when they start doing well, it like lifts everyone else's spirits and they kind of like want to be a part of that momentum. I think, like the Olympics, for example, last year there wasn't quite that momentum throughout the competition. So yeah, I think that like good performances often beget better ones.
Collective experience, that's a key word, right here. I mean, right, it was pretty much visible, particularly with the women, right?
Yeah, especially with the women. And yeah, I think that like people sort of discount how well these athletes know each other, or at least like from the United States. I mean, it's not that the top athletes here don't know each other, but you might have 3 people in a 5,000, but they've never run a mile or a kilometer together. Whereas Ethiopian athletes, for the most part, if they're on the national team, they've probably done tons and tons of training with each other. So like that experience of having a teammate, watching them do well, it is like really inspiring. I think anyone that's like run on a, university cross country team can kind of attest to that. But I think in Ethiopia in particular, that emphasis on group training, Borenstein, it's so important. The concept that you like could run individually is totally foreign. Doing research, that was always like, when I would be running on my own, people kind of be like, you can't adapt that way. You can't adjust, like you can't grow in that sort of way. So,
but this is not to say that they are not in competition with each other, which is a key element in competitions, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I even know like some athletes that really struggle with that. One runner told an agent who told me that like she really didn't want to run this marathon because she was going to be competing against her teammate. But at the same time, I think that, all the athletes like understand that, but they also know that they need each other in the training to get stronger. Again, this kind of like emphasis on Borenstein is like really important in something that people talk about a lot.
How are athletes made in Ethiopia, you think? Oh, it's a very broad question, but
it's a great question. I think it's the question that I ask, and I feel like I'm still asking, even though I've written an entire dissertation about it. I think that they make themselves, but I think that they're made like through their training, but also their relationships and how they navigate those relationships. The depth in Ethiopia is like remarkable. Like the amount of talent, I think, is something that until you go and see it, it's like hard to grasp just how many good athletes there are. And so in order to like succeed to the highest ranks, I think you have to not only be really good at running, that's obviously prerequisite, but you have to be able to like figure out how to navigate how your life is also going to change really dramatically. So I talk about relationships in particular that women have with, friends and mothers and the expectations of motherhood, but also husbands and some of the kind of tricky situations that women can get into coming from the countryside to the city to eventually internationally, relationships with agents and ultimately sponsors. Running's not, it is an individual sport, but it's also highly social in like a multitude of ways. So all of these things kind of converge.
You said made themselves despite the odds, right? I mean,
yeah,
not all, particularly women, are encouraged to make it, right? And
of course.
You talk about that in some detail in your work.
Despite the odds is probably, definitely something I should have included. I think I first came to Ethiopia in 2013. Yeah. And I came pretty like naively and pretty like wide-eyed and starry-eyed and expected that I was going to meet all these athletes who like, it's not that running is not a source of cultural pride and like national pride. I think it is for a lot of people, but there were a lot of athletes, especially women, who were going into running, and like from the get-go, their mothers, their family members like opposed this. It was not seen as something that was like proper, like even sort of like the most baseline, they were like fighting so many obstacles just to like have a chance at running. And then they're like, like I said, so many hazards along the way. And so some of them don't make it. Many of them don't. Or, I mean, of course, the question is always like, what does make it? Because that can mean very different things to different people. But yeah, I have friends that like never really succeeded in running, but I think that their relationship with running and their experience doing it has also colored the way that they live their lives in very interesting ways. And like that, so there's like a legacy there where it does still make them or they make it themselves in some kind of capacity moving forward.
Right. It requires some form of endurance, right?
Yeah, I think the whole project of becoming a runner is, and some that people, I mean, one thing you see in Ethiopia is people pursuing it for a long period of time, much longer than, the athletes, like where most of them come from, their opportunities to make a significant living are so, running is really like, I used to have a friend who used to, she'd be like, like what option was there? I didn't have any other options, like growing up. And it's kind of, if you come from the countryside, even the promise of like getting a school education doesn't really guarantee you
where most of them come from.
Yeah, exactly. So like people will pursue running 10, 15, 20 years if they can get into a club because, Leila Merchetielam is what they would say sometimes. It's like, I didn't really have any other options.
What does it take for a prospective athlete to be noticed, to be spotted?
Yeah. I mean, I think like agents will tell you, and I think that there's a lot of truth to this, like going to competitions, watching athletes who are obviously talented and look young, because everybody knows that people will change their age. Sometimes when they like are about to approach competition, agents want to see that. But I think a big part of it is also like, especially more and more, because the dynamics of how you make money in running have shifted a lot in recent years in terms of like the marketability component. But I think people, it's like how you can work with an athlete too. Like they're unfortunately so not reliant, but intertwined with this international economy. And in order to access that, if you don't speak English, like you really need an agent. You can't do it yourself. And you need a support system of coaches, and for women, usually husbands, to like help support them with their finances. So it's tricky because, again, these pitfalls, like you have to be able to navigate these relationships well to like truly be successful in the ultimate sense. But as we know from especially situations in Kenya, but Ethiopian athletes know it well too. I'm referring to Agnes Tirop, who was this Kenyan athlete who was murdered last year. And but Ethiopian athletes were talking about it as well. And they were like, it's the same here a lot of times. It doesn't always end in extreme violence, but this kind of notion of women feeling like men are, hanging out, trying to, not all, obviously, like there are plenty of wonderful, good, well-intentioned husbands, but people who are trying to see these women athletes as like, you know, cash cows essentially, or like just people to earn them money. That's a huge dynamic at play that people are aware of. And that's, you know, what happens like in countries where there's not a lot of resources and opportunities. Like people are trying to make a living the best they can, no matter how.
Right. So it's like, as you discuss in your dissertation, it's a global south basically generating a pool, you know, athletes, and the global north consuming it, making profit, making money out of it.
That's how I look at it, without being too reductionist. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's true. Like, I think that you need these Ethiopian and Kenyan athletes are producing the fastest times. They've really like extended the lengths, for example, of like what is possible in running, which translates to everything. So it's so relatable. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that part of the problem is that the athletes don't always see themselves as value producers in the way that like I do, or like as much as like as reliant as the system kind of is on their athletic labor. But yeah, I mean, there are people that are making a lot of money, and institutions that are, and corporations that are.
They're not very few. There are plenty of them, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that people like discount how lucrative the sport is. Even in the West, they do, because like athletes here relatively don't make that much money. But, you know, like an Ethiopian athlete who runs 10 minutes faster in a marathon will maybe make like a $5,000-$10,000 salary in Ethiopia. And that same athlete in the US could be making $30,000, which is like not a lot of money, but it's, you know, they're still being, the valuation of like how their ability is so much lower in a country like Ethiopia. And I know like what the counter arguments would be by agents and sponsors. Like I've had those conversations before.
Right.
But yeah, there is like a huge discrepancy in terms of how that's valued. And a lot of a lot of it's like this underpaid or unpaid at all labor of these like thousands upon thousands of athletes who, like you said earlier, don't make it. But they contribute to this kind of collective success.
But is it perhaps the inability of athletes to negotiate well? Is that probably one of the problems? Or even if they do, they are facing a huge bureaucracy or you know, corporations that wouldn't be easy to challenge.
Yeah, I think there are like several difficulties like within first the sport as it's governed and run like internationally, like the sport of running generally, and then the sort of like international components of running, and then the like geopolitical and racialized dynamics of that. Because I mean, it's confusing like who is even one's boss in running. You know, when you have a sport like a more team-based sport where you are like paid a salary by a federation or something like that, like that's not true in running really at all. World Athletics, the governing body, doesn't really support athletes. They don't pay them. They're mostly paid by private sponsors. So even when you like, if you were going to kind of demand some kind of collective action, a lot of times there's like most of the athletes go to the governing body, who, you know, obviously, and World Athletics is like a very old bureaucratic system, much like the IOC, which doesn't, you know, split revenue between athletes and owners, like things like that, which is present in other sports. And so because their structure is, in my view, more archaic in a lot of ways, the structural ways of combating that are much more complicated. And then, yeah, you have the international component and the fact that, you know, athletes, there's so many different languages spoken. I mean, there's a lot of really difficult ways that they could like ask for change.
And it's interesting, the introduction, if you will, of that, the tracking watch.
Yeah.
Has helped facilitate the process, but at the same time, it has become a tool for exploitation. That's how we argue, right? Yeah,
I think that people would like take the term exploitation as extreme, as I like sometimes use it, but I'm mostly trying to like actually track how value is accumulated and like who profits off of what. So like the sort of textbook definition of exploitation is like someone is like not being paid, like not being compensated to the amount that they're producing value. So that's like how I'm thinking about it. but yeah, I mean, again, in 2013, everything was done in time. I came, there were like these really basic Casio, Seiko watches. Everybody always had a watch. And then over the years, these kind of GPS watches like started flooding the running scene. And now I wouldn't say everybody has them, but a lot more athletes do. And, the interesting thing here is that like, this is, the athletes view this as like a huge boon. I mean, scientific advance in general is like welcomed by athletes, I think, all over the world. They want to like better their training. They want to have every advantage possible, but they're not always as keenly like aware of how their data is being used. And that's not really part of the conversation as much as it is, at least here, like a lot of people are talking right now about data, whether it's
data is transferred in real time to labs in the US, for example. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so for top athletes, that's true. Yeah. And then there's just there's lots of modes of surveillance I think that can take place. I think the ones I'm interested are like how these corporations are using data. And like a lot of the times the answer is we don't totally know. But then also, so their coaches might track their data, their husbands might track their data. Of course, they're tracking themselves. But yeah, and on sort of a more extreme level, there are arrangements with corporations and labs that are looking at this data. And again, the sort of like, it's to make them better athletes. That's sort of like the way it's explained. But one, to what end is like what I want to ask. And two, how else are they using that data? Which, and like what are the ethics of using data and not really informing the subjects? I mean, as a researcher,
you have asked those questions, right?
Yeah. And so like what I was finding was that, I think that a lot of people don't consult Ethiopian athletes about their feelings because they like don't think that they're smart enough or educated enough to make informed decisions. Like I've heard that a lot is like, oh, well, they don't have school, like they can't read, whatever. But so a lot of people that, especially if they don't speak Amharic, they won't even like talk to them. But and I'm not saying that that's not true, but a lot of athletes like are interested. They're just used to be in a submissive role where they don't feel like they can ask questions. So there's a lot of these like geopolitical, racial power dynamics in play. And I think like I'm keenly aware of them just because I've been I had like undergraduate advisor who told me like, you're going to be in a position of power, whether or not you realize it or not. That's just like a white researcher in a foreign place. Like you automatically are. So you have to like figure out how best you can deal with that. If people aren't used to being asked questions and like how they feel about things, they're not going to just all of a sudden come out and voice it. So you have to, I think it would be like at least a little bit better if there was some kind of way to have that conversation before you just like strap a watch on an athlete and say like, this is going to make you a better runner. Perhaps that's idealistic, but yeah.
But for now, that seems to be the only way out, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just found that like, even when I would talk to athletes about their contracts or whatever, and they were asking questions, like I found that some of them would if you give them the opportunity, they will ask questions. Like they are curious about how things work. But I think a lot of times like sponsors and agents and also governing bodies, they just like don't think that the athletes will be able to understand it, or they don't want to take the time to explain it to them and try and find new ways to explain it to them. A lot of that is often like given to the work of the Ethiopian staff who work in offices, like on behalf of these folks, but they're overworked. And so like a lot of times so much gets lost in translation. But then the athletes are just kind of like sitting there and then they get angry, maybe because like what said on their contract, the money they were supposed to make, there was a reduction and they didn't understand it. But the reason why like they didn't understand it was because it was never really explained to them in a way that they could understand. But
many of them feel that they are shortchanged, right?
I think most of them do. Yeah. And like rightfully so. I think, again, there's this kind of like huge, I always look at it as there's a lot lost in translation, and a lot of it's linguistic translation between like English and Amharic or Oromo, whatever language they speak. And a lot of it's cultural translation. And so contracts are complicated, like often with sponsors and with races, and there are reductions if you don't perform a certain amount of times or to a certain level. There are taxes that get taken out. If you win a race in a foreign country, agents get a cut of everything that you earn. So on paper, like it can be really disorienting. Like, oh, it says I won $10,000. Why am I only taking home 5 or 4,000 of that? And then also, you know, of course, Ethiopian athletes have to contend with the fact that their families are like, wait, why aren't you rich? You like went abroad and won a race. You should have endless amounts of money. So they're dealing with that stress. And, but a lot of times, yeah, I mean, I think that they are aware that they are being shortchanged. They just don't always know what to do about it or if they can do anything about it.
Anyway, this process could be democratized, if you will, in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think that like, again, I think it's the reason why it's complicated is because it's an international sport. And so I think that there has to be some form of collective bargaining in running. Most other federations have it. And then I think that there's definitely like a lot of ways that it could be democratized, but like World Athletics, you know, they are very good at making decisions without asking any of the athletes their input. They do that all the time. You know, I look at a sport like the NBA in the United States or the MLB, and I know that structures are different, but those athletes, part of the reason why they're so successful is because the sport is popular, but part of it is because they have like incredibly impressive collective bargaining agreements. I mean, those athletes, I tell athletes all the time, those athletes get 50% of revenue shares in most cases. They can make demands, they can walk out, but I think like, unfortunately, collective action it's like sometimes it's the hardest thing to generate and organize, but it does have the best effect. I think that people always fear if I step out, someone will just come in and take my place. And that's why like a sense of solidarity would have to be extremely strong, but it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think it necessarily means like a big strike. I just think it means like demanding a bigger piece of the pie. You know, there's like, I think that there's a lot more money to go around than goes around.
So you literally lived with plenty of athletes who are doing your research. And I assume that there must have been plenty of heartbreaking moments as there were uplifting ones. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's way more heartbreaking moments than there are uplifting ones. I think that sometimes in sports, we suffer from a little bit of amnesia after like a good performance. We kind of sometimes forget all the bad ones. And I think that there are way more lows than highs. Yeah, I mean, I've seen tons of, you know, I've seen experiences of course, injury. That's always a heartbreak. But then, you know, like an athlete, you know, like one athlete I know kind of getting pregnant at just like a rough time and getting very sick from the pregnancy, having the baby, and then, you know, wanting to return to running, being told by her family that she can't. And like for years and years, athletes or former athletes having to contend with those expectations, especially women. And just all kind, you know, running is such an intense sport on your body, and it's so simple because all you have to do is run, but that's also what's so complicated about it. So, yeah, I mean, I think that I could tell tons of stories about heartbreak that extend pretty far beyond the borders of Ethiopia as well. But you know, I think that there is sort of it's not encouraged that people share those stories maybe as much. Yeah, I mean, the victories are more exciting to share. They have better sort of storybook endings, but yeah.
Well, Hannah Borenstein, it was really a pleasure having you on my show. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.